Jordan Peterson begins his philosophy with a question that has concerned human beings for thousands of years. How can an individual create order, meaning, and responsibility within a world that often appears chaotic, uncertain, and filled with suffering? And from this question emerges a worldview that combines psychology, mythology, religion, evolutionary theory, personal responsibility, and existential reflection into a broad attempt to explain how people can live meaningful lives despite the difficulties and tragedies that inevitably accompany existence. At the center of his philosophy lies the conviction that suffering is not an exception to life, but one of its fundamental realities. Human beings experience loss, illness, failure, aging, conflict, uncertainty, and death regardless of intelligence, wealth, or social position. Because suffering is unavoidable, he argues that the primary challenge of existence is not how to eliminate pain completely, but how to confront it in a way that prevents despair from overwhelming life itself. This concern leads him toward the concept of meaning. He believes many modern individuals pursue happiness directly, assuming that comfort, pleasure, or personal satisfaction should be the ultimate goals of life. Yet he argues that happiness is too fragile and temporary to provide a stable foundation for existence. Difficult circumstances inevitably arise, and when they do, a life organized solely around comfort often collapses. Meaning, by contrast, can sustain individuals even during suffering because it connects them to responsibilities, purposes, and values greater than immediate emotional states. For him, meaning emerges most powerfully through responsibility. Human beings discover purpose not primarily by asking what they can receive from the world, but by asking what they can contribute to it. Responsibility directs attention outward toward family, work, community, creativity, and moral obligation, and this outward orientation helps individuals transcend excessive self-focus, which he believes often intensifies anxiety and despair. A recurring theme throughout his thought is the tension between order and chaos. He views order as the realm of stability, structure, predictability, tradition, and established knowledge. Chaos, by contrast, represents uncertainty, transformation, possibility, danger, and the unknown. Human existence unfolds between these two realities constantly. Too much order leads to rigidity, stagnation, and lifeless routine. Too much chaos produces confusion, instability, and fear. A meaningful life, therefore, requires navigating the boundary between them rather than becoming trapped entirely within either extreme. He often uses myths, religious stories, and ancient narratives to illustrate this balance. Rather than reading traditional stories merely as historical accounts or literal events, he treats them as symbolic representations of recurring psychological patterns. Across cultures and centuries, human beings repeatedly tell stories about heroes confronting unknown territories, descending into danger, facing suffering, and returning transformed. And he sees these narratives as reflections of deep truths about personal development and human psychology. The hero, in his interpretation, represents the individual willing to voluntarily confront uncertainty instead of retreating from it. Growth occurs not through avoiding challenges, but through engaging them directly. Every meaningful achievement requires entering unfamiliar territory, risking failure, and learning from experience. People develop competence, confidence, and wisdom precisely by facing difficulties rather than remaining protected from them indefinitely. Truth occupies an important place within this framework. He believes individuals frequently distort reality in order to avoid responsibility, reduce anxiety, or gain short-term advantages. Yet these distortions accumulate consequences over time. Small acts of dishonesty create larger problems, and eventually reality asserts itself regardless of personal preference. Because of this, he argues that truthful speech is one of the most important moral practices available to human beings. Speaking truthfully helps align individuals with reality rather than fantasy, creating a foundation upon which meaningful action becomes possible. He becomes particularly concerned with resentment, because he sees it as a powerful force capable of poisoning individual lives. When people experience suffering, failure, or injustice, they often face a choice between assuming responsibility for what they can change and directing blame entirely outward. While genuine injustices exist, he believes excessive resentment traps individuals psychologically, preventing constructive action by encouraging fixation upon grievances rather than possibilities for growth and adaptation. This does not mean he denies social problems or structural difficulties. Rather, he emphasizes that individuals retain agency even within imperfect conditions. Human beings may not control everything that happens to them, but they retain some responsibility for how they respond to circumstances, and this response often determines whether suffering becomes transformative or destructive. His philosophy also places strong emphasis on competence. He believes confidence emerges primarily from demonstrated ability rather than positive thinking alone. Individuals gain genuine self-respect by developing skills, meeting challenges, fulfilling obligations, and becoming capable contributors within their communities. Self-esteem detached from achievement or responsibility often remains fragile because it lacks concrete foundations. The family occupies a significant role in his thought because he sees it as one of the primary environments where responsibility, cooperation, sacrifice, and social development occur. Through relationships with parents, children, partners, and communities, individuals learn how to balance personal desires with obligations toward others, and these experiences contribute to moral and psychological maturity. Religion also plays a central role, though not always in a strictly theological sense. He often interprets religious traditions psychologically, viewing them as repositories of accumulated human wisdom developed over centuries. Religious stories, symbols, and rituals encode lessons about suffering, sacrifice, morality, responsibility, and meaning, and even individuals who do not hold traditional religious beliefs may find value within these symbolic structures because they address enduring features of human existence. Sacrifice becomes particularly important because meaningful goals almost always require giving up something in the present for something greater in the future. Education requires sacrificing leisure. Relationships require sacrificing selfish impulses. Achievement requires discipline and effort. Civilization itself depends upon countless acts of delayed gratification, and therefore the capacity to sacrifice becomes one of the foundations of both personal success and social stability. Underlying all these ideas is his belief that human beings possess far greater potential than they often realize. Many people underestimate their capacity to endure hardship, develop competence, assume responsibility, and transform their lives. Fear, uncertainty, and self-doubt frequently prevent individuals from pursuing meaningful goals. Yet growth becomes possible when people voluntarily accept challenges rather than waiting for perfect conditions or complete certainty. As his philosophy develops further, it becomes clear that he views life not as a search for comfort, but as a continual process of confronting reality honestly, taking responsibility for one's actions, and striving toward meaningful aims despite suffering and uncertainty. Human beings cannot eliminate chaos from existence, nor can they escape mortality, but they can choose how they respond to these realities, and within that response lies the possibility of purpose, dignity, and personal transformation. As his philosophy develops further, he becomes increasingly interested in the psychological consequences of avoiding responsibility, because he believes many forms of human suffering are intensified when individuals refuse to confront difficult realities directly. Problems ignored do not disappear. They often grow larger over time, accumulating beneath the surface until they become overwhelming. And because of this, he repeatedly argues that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face what is frightening before it becomes unmanageable. He sees modern individuals surrounded by opportunities and freedoms that previous generations could scarcely imagine, yet many remain anxious, uncertain, and directionless because freedom alone does not provide orientation. The absence of clear responsibility can become as psychologically difficult as excessive restriction. When people lack meaningful goals, obligations, or purposes, they often experience a sense of emptiness that no amount of entertainment, consumption, or distraction can permanently resolve. This concern leads him toward the idea that meaning emerges from voluntary engagement with life's challenges rather than from passive comfort. Human beings grow through effort. Skills develop through practice. Character develops through adversity. Wisdom develops through experience. A person who attempts to avoid all difficulty may temporarily reduce discomfort, but often sacrifices long-term development in the process, gradually becoming more fragile rather than stronger. He frequently emphasizes that life presents individuals with a choice. One path involves accepting responsibility for improving what can be improved, however small those improvements may seem. The other path involves resentment, blame, passivity, and withdrawal. While external circumstances matter greatly, he argues that focusing exclusively on what cannot be controlled often leaves individuals powerless, whereas focusing on achievable actions creates momentum and restores a sense of agency. This is why he places such importance on small acts of order. Cleaning a room, organizing a schedule, fulfilling commitments, maintaining honesty, caring for one's health, or addressing neglected responsibilities may appear insignificant individually. Yet these actions represent something larger. They are expressions of the willingness to bring order into a world that naturally contains uncertainty and disorder. And over time, such habits accumulate into a more stable and meaningful life. He becomes deeply interested in the relationship between competence and confidence because he believes many people attempt to acquire confidence directly without first developing the abilities that make confidence legitimate. Genuine self-respect arises when individuals demonstrate to themselves that they can handle challenges, solve problems, and fulfill obligations. Confidence built solely on reassurance often collapses under pressure, whereas confidence rooted in competence becomes more durable because it is supported by experience. Another major theme in his philosophy is the importance of confronting fear voluntarily. He argues that avoided fears tend to expand psychologically. The more individuals retreat from challenges, conversations, responsibilities, or uncertainties, the larger those things appear over time. By contrast, confronting fears often reveals them to be more manageable than imagined. Growth, therefore, occurs not by eliminating anxiety first, but by acting despite anxiety and allowing courage to develop through experience. This idea connects closely to his understanding of mythological heroes. Across countless stories, heroes leave familiar environments and enter unknown territory where danger, uncertainty, and transformation await. He interprets these narratives psychologically, seeing them as symbolic representations of personal development itself. Every individual encounters situations where they must step beyond what is familiar and confront the unknown, and these moments often become turning points that shape character and identity. He also reflects deeply on the nature of evil, rejecting simplistic explanations that treat wrongdoing as something committed only by extraordinary monsters. Human beings possess capacities for cruelty, deception, selfishness, and destruction, and history repeatedly demonstrates how ordinary individuals can participate in harmful systems when they abandon personal responsibility or moral awareness. Because of this, he believes self-examination is essential. Individuals should not assume they are automatically virtuous simply because their intentions seem good. This emphasis on personal responsibility extends into morality. He argues that ethical behavior is not merely a matter of holding correct opinions, but of acting in ways that contribute positively to the lives of others and to society more broadly. Good intentions alone are insufficient if they are not accompanied by discipline, honesty, competence, and genuine concern for consequences. His interest in hierarchy also becomes important here. He observes that hierarchies exist throughout nature and human society, not all of them based purely on power or oppression, but often emerging from differences in skill, experience, competence, and contribution. While hierarchies can become corrupt and unjust, he believes they cannot simply be abolished entirely because many serve practical functions. The challenge is not eliminating all hierarchy, but ensuring that systems remain as fair, flexible, and merit-based as possible. At the same time, he warns against comparing oneself obsessively to others. Constant comparison often generates envy, discouragement, and resentment because there will always be people who are more successful, talented, wealthy, or fortunate. A healthier approach, he suggests, is comparing oneself to one's past self, focusing on gradual improvement rather than endless competition. Progress becomes meaningful when measured against personal growth rather than external status alone. He also sees gratitude as an important counterbalance to suffering. Life contains tragedy, but it also contains beauty, friendship, love, creativity, discovery, and moments of profound meaning. Individuals who focus exclusively on suffering may become consumed by bitterness, while those who recognize both the hardships and the gifts of existence often develop greater resilience. Gratitude does not deny suffering. It prevents suffering from becoming the only reality one can see. As these reflections deepen, his philosophy increasingly becomes a call to voluntary responsibility. Human beings cannot control every event that shapes their lives, nor can they eliminate uncertainty, mortality, or suffering, but they can choose whether they will face these realities actively or passively. They can choose whether they will tell the truth or hide behind deception, whether they will confront challenges or avoid them, whether they will build competence or surrender to helplessness. And for him, it is through these choices, repeated day after day across ordinary life, that individuals gradually construct meaning, strengthen character, and create lives capable of withstanding the inevitable difficulties that accompany the human condition. As his philosophy moves deeper into the question of how human beings should live, he becomes increasingly focused on the relationship between individual transformation and the larger problems of society, because he believes many people are tempted to concentrate exclusively on changing the world while neglecting the difficult task of changing themselves. And although social reform may be necessary, he argues that lasting improvement becomes fragile when individuals lack the discipline, responsibility, and self-awareness required to sustain it. He observes that human beings possess a remarkable tendency to underestimate their own flaws while exaggerating the flaws of others. It is often easier to criticize institutions, governments, cultures, or social groups than to confront personal weaknesses directly, because self-confrontation is uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging mistakes, limitations, contradictions, and failures that challenge one's preferred image of oneself. Yet he believes this confrontation is essential because meaningful growth begins with honesty rather than self-deception. This concern leads him toward the idea that personal responsibility is not merely practical but moral. Individuals influence families, workplaces, friendships, and communities through countless small actions. Every lie, promise, habit, decision, and attitude contributes to the broader social environment. Society is not an abstract entity existing separately from individuals. It is continuously shaped by the behavior of millions of people acting within their daily lives, and therefore improving the world often begins with improving one's own conduct. He becomes particularly interested in the danger of ideological thinking when it offers overly simple explanations for complex realities. Human existence is extraordinarily complicated. People are influenced by biology, culture, history, economics, psychology, relationships, chance, and countless other factors. Yet ideologies often reduce this complexity into narratives that identify a single cause behind all suffering and a single solution capable of fixing everything. Such simplifications can be emotionally appealing because they provide certainty, but he believes they frequently distort reality and create new problems. History serves as an important warning in this regard. He studies periods where political movements promised utopian futures while producing immense suffering because they ignored the complexity of human nature. Individuals convinced of their own moral righteousness may become dangerous when they believe any action is justified in service of an ideal vision. For this reason, he emphasizes humility, arguing that people should remain cautious about their ability to redesign society according to abstract theories while overlooking unintended consequences. At the same time, he rejects cynicism. Recognizing human flaws does not mean abandoning hope. Rather, it means understanding that progress is difficult, fragile, and dependent upon continuous effort. Human beings are capable of remarkable creativity, compassion, and achievement, but they are also capable of cruelty, self-deception, and destruction. Any realistic philosophy must account for both possibilities simultaneously. His reflections on meaning continue deepening here. He believes meaningful lives are often built around responsibilities voluntarily accepted rather than pleasures passively received. Raising children, caring for family members, pursuing demanding goals, serving communities, mastering skills, and contributing to something larger than oneself frequently involves sacrifice, frustration, and effort. Yet these same activities often generate the deepest sense of fulfillment because they connect individuals to purposes extending beyond immediate gratification. He becomes increasingly skeptical of the modern tendency to view freedom primarily as the absence of constraints. While freedom is important, he argues that complete freedom without direction can become overwhelming and destabilizing. Human beings require structure, goals, values, and responsibilities to orient themselves. Without these frameworks, freedom risks becoming aimlessness rather than opportunity. This concern extends into his understanding of identity. Many people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to discover who they truly are. Yet he often frames identity less as something hidden waiting to be found and more as something developed through action. Individuals learn who they are by making choices, taking responsibility, confronting challenges, and participating in life. Character emerges through lived experience rather than passive introspection alone. He also emphasizes the importance of truthful speech as a means of psychological integration. When individuals consistently distort reality, conceal intentions, or tell lies, they create divisions within themselves. Maintaining falsehood requires continuous effort because reality must constantly be adjusted to support the deception. Truthfulness, by contrast, allows individuals to align thought, speech, and action more closely, creating a stronger and more coherent sense of self. Suffering remains central throughout these reflections because he never assumes life can become free from tragedy. Illness, death, aging, betrayal, failure, and loss remain permanent features of the human condition. The question is therefore not whether suffering exists, but how individuals respond when it arrives. Some become consumed by bitterness and resentment. Others use suffering as an opportunity for growth, wisdom, compassion, and deeper understanding. The difference often lies not in circumstances alone, but in the attitude and response chosen. He finds inspiration in individuals who voluntarily carry heavy burdens without surrendering to despair. Such people demonstrate that meaning can coexist with hardship and that dignity does not depend entirely upon external success. Their lives suggest that strength emerges not from avoiding difficulty, but from confronting it honestly and persistently. As these ideas continue unfolding, his philosophy increasingly appears as an attempt to reconcile ancient questions with modern life. The world changes technologically and culturally, yet human beings continue facing many of the same fundamental challenges: how to deal with suffering, how to find meaning, how to act responsibly, how to tell the truth, how to build character, and how to live in a way that justifies existence despite its inevitable hardships. And so his thought keeps returning to a central conviction that individuals possess more capacity for growth, resilience, responsibility, and transformation than they often realize, and that by voluntarily engaging with life's difficulties rather than fleeing from them, people can create lives that are not necessarily easy or comfortable, but deeply meaningful and worthy of respect. As his philosophy reaches its final point, everything returns to the idea that life is not primarily a search for comfort, but a confrontation with reality. Human existence contains suffering, uncertainty, failure, loss, and mortality, and no amount of wealth, technology, or progress can remove these realities completely. The question is therefore not how to escape them, but how to live in a way that makes them bearable. For him, the answer lies in meaning, and meaning emerges through responsibility. Individuals find purpose when they commit themselves to goals, relationships, duties, and values that extend beyond immediate personal satisfaction. A meaningful life often requires sacrifice, discipline, and effort, yet these burdens give structure and direction to existence. Without responsibility, freedom can easily become confusion. With responsibility, even suffering can become part of a larger purpose. He believes that character is built gradually through countless small choices. Telling the truth when it is difficult, keeping promises, facing fears, fulfilling obligations, and confronting problems rather than avoiding them may seem ordinary, but over time these actions shape the kind of person one becomes. Meaning is rarely found through dramatic revelations alone. More often, it is constructed through daily acts of courage and responsibility. Throughout his philosophy, he repeatedly warns against resentment, victimhood, and passivity. While injustice and hardship are real, individuals still possess the capacity to improve aspects of their lives and to respond constructively to adversity. Focusing entirely on what cannot be controlled often leads to helplessness, while taking responsibility for what can be changed creates strength and momentum. He also insists that human beings are far more resilient than they often believe. People can endure tremendous difficulties when they have a reason to move forward. They can develop competence, wisdom, and courage through challenges that initially appear overwhelming. Growth rarely occurs in complete safety. It emerges when individuals voluntarily confront the unknown and learn from the experience. In the end, his philosophy offers neither easy optimism nor despair. Instead, it presents a demanding vision of life where meaning must be earned through engagement with reality itself. The world will always contain chaos alongside order, suffering alongside joy, uncertainty alongside stability. But individuals retain the ability to face these realities honestly, to carry responsibility willingly, and to build lives grounded in purpose rather than comfort alone. And so his final message remains simple but powerful. Straighten what you can straighten. Tell the truth as best you can. Carry the responsibilities that life places before you, and move forward despite uncertainty. Because meaning is not found by avoiding the difficulties of existence, but by confronting them with courage, discipline, and integrity. Before Jordan Peterson became famous, before television debates, before internet outrage, before millions of people clipped his lectures into motivational videos, there was a young man sitting alone late at night in a small Canadian town trying to understand why human beings become monsters. Not metaphorically, literally. He was obsessed with one terrifying question that most people instinctively avoid because it threatens the comforting image they have of themselves. How does an ordinary person become capable of cruelty? Not a fictional villain, not some mythical psychopath separated from society. An ordinary citizen, a neighbor, a teacher, a father, a student. This question followed him for years like a shadow, and it began long before the fame. Jordan Peterson was born in 1962 in the isolated northern landscapes of Alberta, Canada, where the winters were brutal and life carried a certain hardness modern cities rarely experience anymore. There was space everywhere, endless roads, forest oil towns, small communities where people survived not through fashionable ideas, but through competence, endurance, and responsibility. The environment shaped him deeply. In places where nature itself can kill you through cold, distance, or isolation, chaos is not an abstract philosophical concept. Chaos is real. A broken machine matters. Weakness matters. Carelessness matters. Survival depends on discipline and structure. Years later, these ideas would reappear constantly in his philosophy, without people fully realizing where they came from. As a child, he was intensely introspective. He observed people carefully. He noticed hidden tensions adults tried to conceal beneath ordinary social behavior. Anger inside families, fear behind politeness, fragility beneath confidence. Even early in life, he sensed that civilization was thinner than it appeared. But the real psychological rupture came during adolescence when he became consumed by history, especially the 20th century. The deeper he studied Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, the more disturbed he became. Millions dead, entire populations manipulated, citizens obeying systems that transformed industrial society into machinery for mass suffering. And what shocked him most was not the brutality itself. History always contained brutality. What shocked him was how ordinary the participants often seemed. Government clerks organized deportations. Teachers repeated propaganda. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. Entire populations adapted themselves slowly to moral collapse while convincing themselves they were still civilized people. This realization destabilized him psychologically because it destroyed the comforting fantasy that evil belongs only to obviously evil individuals. The line separating civilization from barbarism suddenly looked terrifyingly fragile, and he began suspecting something darker about human nature. Under the right conditions, almost anyone could become dangerous. Most people spend their lives avoiding this possibility because it creates unbearable moral responsibility. If ordinary individuals are capable of participating in evil, then morality is not simply about believing correct ideas. It requires constant psychological vigilance against resentment, fear, self-deception, and ideological possession. These thoughts stayed with him constantly through university. At first, he studied political science because he wanted to understand power and authoritarian systems intellectually. But politics alone frustrated him. Political explanations felt too shallow. They described structures and ideologies without explaining the psychological hunger underneath them. Why do human beings surrender themselves to rigid belief systems? Why do crowds become emotionally intoxicated by certainty? Why does resentment spread faster than wisdom? Why do people lie even when they know they are lying? These questions eventually pulled him toward psychology, and once he entered that world, something clicked into place. Psychology gave him a language for the hidden forces shaping human behavior beneath rational thought. He became fascinated by Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who believed the human mind contains ancient symbolic structures inherited across generations. Jung argued that myths, dreams, religious stories, and archetypes reflected deep psychological truths about fear, sacrifice, transformation, suffering, and chaos. This fascinated Peterson because suddenly religion no longer looked childish or primitive. It looked psychologically profound. Biblical stories, myths, and ancient narratives survived thousands of years not merely because people were superstitious, but because these stories encoded survival wisdom about human nature itself. And one pattern appeared repeatedly across cultures. The hero voluntarily confronts chaos. This idea became foundational in Peterson's worldview, because chaos, to him, was not simply disorder in the external world. Chaos was psychological. Chaos appears when a marriage collapses, when addiction destroys structure, when depression makes ordinary life unbearable, when someone loses meaning, when suffering arrives unexpectedly and destroys the identity a person once depended upon. Most people, he believed, tried desperately to avoid chaos through distraction, comfort, ideology, or denial. But avoided chaos grows larger in the dark. Eventually, it consumes the individual from within. This was one reason he became deeply skeptical of modern culture's obsession with comfort and emotional safety. During years working as a clinical psychologist, he saw people psychologically collapsing not only because life was cruel, but because they lacked inner structure strong enough to endure suffering meaningfully. He saw brilliant people unable to wake up consistently. People with enormous potential trapped in addiction and passivity. Young men disappearing into isolation, pornography, games, resentment, and self-hatred. Individuals constructing false identities because they no longer knew who they genuinely were. And beneath many of these struggles, he noticed the same hidden pattern. A loss of responsibility. Without responsibility, time becomes shapeless. Without structure, the mind begins decaying. Without meaningful struggle, people become psychologically weak. And weakness eventually transforms into resentment. This was one of the darkest conclusions he reached clinically. Human beings denied meaning often begin craving destruction instead. A person ashamed of their own weakness may secretly start hating competence itself. Someone unable to build a meaningful life may attack meaning wherever they see it. This is why resentment frightened him so deeply. Because resentment does not merely produce sadness. It produces ideological hunger, the desire to blame, the desire to punish, the desire to destroy what reminds someone of their own failure. And once resentment spreads socially, entire societies can become psychologically unstable. This was the deeper warning underneath nearly all his lectures. Civilization survives only when enough individuals voluntarily choose responsibility over resentment, truth over comforting lies, and meaning over passive nihilism. Because once enough people abandon those choices, chaos returns frighteningly fast. By the time Jordan Peterson began teaching at Harvard in the early 1990s, something unusual had already started happening inside him. He was no longer studying psychology as a detached academic discipline. The questions had become personal, urgent, almost existential. Because after years spent studying ideology, mythology, religion, and totalitarianism, he had reached a deeply unsettling conclusion about modern human beings. Most people are not psychologically prepared for suffering. Modern society trains individuals to pursue comfort, stimulation, entertainment, and personal identity, but gives them very little understanding of tragedy, sacrifice, responsibility, or the darkness hidden inside human nature. And when reality eventually breaks the illusion of safety, many collapse emotionally because they built their entire inner world on unstable foundations. This realization intensified during his years as a clinical psychologist. Every week, he sat across from people whose lives were quietly disintegrating. Not always dramatically. Sometimes the collapse looked ordinary from the outside. A student unable to leave bed anymore. A man slowly drinking himself into emotional numbness after divorce. Someone consumed by anxiety because they could no longer tolerate uncertainty. A person trapped in resentment for so many years that bitterness had become their identity. And what struck him repeatedly was how often psychological suffering deepened when people avoided responsibility instead of moving toward it. At first, this sounds backwards. Most individuals instinctively imagine responsibility as pressure, burden, restriction, something reducing freedom. But clinically, he observed the opposite. People without meaningful responsibility often deteriorated frighteningly fast. Without structure, time became shapeless. Without purpose, motivation collapsed. Without voluntary struggle, individuals drifted toward passivity and self-contempt. And once self-contempt takes root deeply enough, people begin hiding from life itself. This was especially visible among young men. Long before the internet turned isolation into a global epidemic, he was already seeing the pattern emerge psychologically. Young men disconnected from meaningful work, discipline, community, and direction often withdrew into fantasy worlds where failure carried no real consequences. Video games, pornography, endless distraction, sleep at sunrise, wake up at noon, repeat tomorrow. Years disappeared this way, and underneath the passivity was often enormous hidden shame. Not because these individuals were lazy in some simplistic moral sense, but because deep down they sensed their potential remaining unused. Human beings need to feel necessary. They need to feel capable of carrying weight in reality itself. Without that feeling, existence begins losing emotional substance. This was one reason responsibility became almost sacred in his philosophy. Not because suffering is enjoyable, but because meaningful responsibility transforms suffering into purpose. A mother waking exhausted every morning to care for her child suffers, yet the suffering contains love and meaning. A craftsman mastering difficult work suffers frustration, but develops competence and dignity. Someone telling the truth despite risk suffers fear, but preserves integrity. Without meaning, pain feels unbearable. With meaning, human beings can endure astonishing hardship. These ideas resonated deeply because modern culture increasingly encouraged the opposite approach to life. Avoid discomfort. Avoid difficulty. Protect yourself emotionally. Curate identity carefully. Seek validation constantly. Escape boredom immediately. But he believes something dangerous happens to people when they avoid all struggle. They become fragile. Not physically alone, psychologically fragile. Unable to tolerate uncertainty. Unable to endure rejection. Unable to confront suffering without collapsing into despair or resentment. And resentment, in his worldview, was one of the most dangerous psychological forces in existence. Because resentment slowly transforms pain into hatred. A person ashamed of their weakness begins attacking strength itself. Someone unable to create meaning starts mocking meaning as illusion. An individual consumed by failure searches desperately for external enemies to blame. This was why he feared ideological thinking so intensely. Ideology offers emotionally satisfying explanations for suffering. It divides the world neatly into oppressors and victims, heroes and villains, good people and evil people. Complexity disappears. Personal responsibility weakens. Hatred becomes morally justified. And history showed repeatedly how quickly this mentality could become catastrophic. The 20th century haunted him precisely because ordinary citizens participated willingly in systems that eventually became monstrous. They believed they were serving justice while surrendering independent thought entirely. This possibility terrified him because he saw similar psychological tendencies still alive inside modern society. Online outrage, mob behavior, public shaming rituals, political tribalism, people increasingly speaking in slogans rather than thinking independently. Entire identities constructed around collective resentment. He believed civilization depends upon individuals maintaining enough psychological integrity to resist these forces internally. Once people abandon truth for emotional comfort, reality itself begins destabilizing socially. This was why truth mattered so much in his lectures. Not because truth is always pleasant. Often truth is painful, but lies fracture the mind over time. A person constantly lying to themselves becomes psychologically divided. Eventually, they no longer know what they genuinely believe. Anxiety grows. Identity fragments. Reality itself starts feeling unstable. Truth, in his worldview, was not merely moral. It was stabilizing. And beneath all these ideas remained the same haunting insight that first disturbed him as a young man studying totalitarianism. Human beings are not naturally civilized creatures who occasionally become corrupted. Civilization is something fragile requiring constant effort, discipline, honesty, sacrifice, and voluntary responsibility to sustain. Without those things, chaos waits patiently underneath everything. What made Jordan Peterson different from most psychologists was that he never saw human beings as simple creatures. To him, every person carried something ancient inside them. Not ancient in a mystical sense, but psychologically ancient. Fear, aggression, tribal instinct, desire for meaning, the longing for order, the temptation of chaos. Civilization looked modern on the surface, but underneath, the same psychological forces that shaped ancient myths were still alive inside ordinary people walking through modern cities with smartphones in their pockets. This was why mythology fascinated him so deeply. While many modern intellectuals dismissed religious stories as primitive superstition, he approached them differently. He believed myths survived thousands of years because they contained compressed psychological wisdom about how human beings survive suffering, temptation, fear, and uncertainty. And among all these stories, one pattern appeared again and again. The individual voluntarily enters chaos and returns transformed. Not because chaos is good, but because avoiding chaos completely produces weakness. This idea became central not only to his philosophy, but to the emotional atmosphere of his lectures. He spoke as though life itself were demanding something from people. Courage, responsibility, honesty, sacrifice. And millions responded because modern culture increasingly felt emotionally hollow by comparison. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, society was changing rapidly. The internet was reshaping identity. Consumer culture intensified. Social interaction became more performative. People started building digital versions of themselves, carefully designed for approval. At the same time, traditional meaning structures weakened further. Many individuals no longer knew what their lives were aimed toward. They had options, endless options, but no orientation. And psychologically, unlimited freedom without direction can become paralyzing. This was one of Peterson's deepest criticisms of modern life. People often imagine freedom means the absence of restriction, but total absence of structure creates anxiety instead of fulfillment. Human beings need responsibility because responsibility organizes existence. Without structure, chaos enters quietly. Sleep patterns collapse. Motivation weakens. Discipline disappears. Time loses meaning. Then slowly, almost invisibly, self-respect begins eroding. He saw this pattern clinically over and over again. Some patients were not destroyed by external tragedy alone. They were collapsing because they had stopped participating in life voluntarily. They withdrew inwardly, avoided challenge, avoided truth, avoided responsibility, and avoidance, in his worldview, was spiritually dangerous. Because avoided problems grow. Ignored fear becomes anxiety. Ignored suffering becomes bitterness. Ignored responsibility becomes shame. Eventually, the individual becomes trapped inside a psychological prison built slowly through avoidance itself. This was why he often spoke harshly about self-deception. A person lying constantly to themselves begins splitting psychologically. One part knows reality. Another part performs a false version of reality to avoid pain. Over time, this creates inner instability because the individual loses contact with what they genuinely believe. Truth mattered deeply to him, not simply as morality, but as psychological survival. A truthful person stands on solid ground internally. A dishonest person eventually fragments. This was also why his lectures carried unusual emotional intensity. He did not speak like someone discussing abstract theories detached from life. He spoke like someone convinced civilization itself depended upon individuals maintaining psychological integrity against chaos. And then came the moment that transformed him from professor into global phenomenon. In 2016, Canada proposed legislation involving gender identity protections and compelled speech concerns. Peterson publicly opposed aspects of the legislation, arguing that governments should not compel language through law. Almost overnight, he became internationally controversial. But the reaction revealed something much larger happening beneath politics. Millions were already emotionally exhausted by ideological conflict, censorship fears, identity battles, and growing social polarization. Some saw him as defending free speech and individual responsibility. Others viewed him as reactionary or dangerous. Suddenly, he was no longer merely a psychology professor. He became a symbol onto which modern society projected enormous cultural anxieties. And the internet amplified everything. Supporters treated him almost like a father figure during a period of social confusion. Critics treated him as representative of broader political dangers they feared spreading globally. Interviews became battlefields. Lectures exploded online. Every sentence became analyzed, clipped, praised, or attacked endlessly. Yet underneath all the political noise remained the same deeper psychological themes that had obsessed him since youth. What happens when societies lose shared meaning? What happens when ideology becomes more important than truth? What happens when individuals define themselves primarily through resentment? What happens when people lose the ability to confront suffering honestly? These questions mattered to him because he believed modern civilization was entering a psychologically unstable era. Social media rewarded outrage more than wisdom. Public discourse became tribal. Nuance disappeared. People increasingly sorted themselves into moral camps where disagreement itself felt threatening. And once societies lose the ability to tolerate complexity, extremism grows naturally. This frightened him profoundly because history had already shown where ideological possession can lead when resentment combines with certainty. The crowds shouting slogans always believe they are righteous while doing it. That was the terrifying lesson history taught him. And perhaps the darkest part of his philosophy was this. The greatest danger to civilization may not come from obvious villains alone. It may come from millions of ordinary people gradually surrendering truth, responsibility, and independent thought because chaos feels easier to escape than confront honestly. As Jordan Peterson's fame grew, something strange began happening around him. Millions of people no longer listened to him merely as a professor. They listened as though he were describing a crisis they already felt privately but had never fully articulated. Not just political confusion, something deeper, a sense that modern life itself had become psychologically disoriented. People were surrounded by stimulation, yet emotionally numb. Surrounded by connection, yet profoundly lonely. Surrounded by freedom, yet unable to decide what their lives were actually for. Entire generations drifted through endless entertainment, digital performance, outrage cycles, and consumer distraction while quietly carrying anxiety they could barely explain even to themselves. And beneath all of it was exhaustion. Mental exhaustion. Spiritual exhaustion. The exhaustion of trying to construct meaning alone in a world that increasingly treated meaning as subjective preference rather than something earned through responsibility, sacrifice, and truth. This was why Peterson's message reached far beyond politics. For many listeners, especially those struggling privately, the lectures felt less like ideology and more like psychological rescue. Not because he promised comfort, but because he treated suffering seriously. Modern culture often speaks about happiness constantly, yet avoids confronting tragedy directly. Peterson moved in the opposite direction. He insisted that suffering is unavoidable. Every human life eventually encounters pain, failure, humiliation, aging, illness, betrayal, and death. The question is not whether suffering exists. The question is what makes suffering bearable. And his answer remained remarkably consistent throughout his life. Meaning, not pleasure, not status, not endless self-expression. Meaning, but meaning in his worldview was not something casually invented. It emerged through voluntary responsibility, through carrying weight honestly, through telling the truth even when lying would feel easier, through confronting chaos instead of escaping into resentment or passivity. This was one reason he admired ancient myths so deeply. Across cultures and centuries, human beings repeatedly told stories about individuals voluntarily descending into darkness and returning transformed. These stories survived because they reflected something psychologically real. Growth requires confrontation. A person avoiding all pain becomes weak. Someone avoiding all responsibility becomes unstable. An individual avoiding truth loses contact with reality itself, and reality always returns eventually. This was perhaps the deepest emotional current underneath his lectures. He spoke as though modern individuals were becoming psychologically fragile because society increasingly encouraged avoidance as a lifestyle. Avoid loneliness through constant stimulation. Avoid insecurity through performance. Avoid suffering through distraction. Avoid meaninglessness through consumption. But the avoided problems never disappeared. They waited underneath the surface, growing silently. He saw this especially in the digital age. Social media transformed identity into spectacle. People increasingly presented edited versions of themselves while privately struggling with anxiety, inadequacy, and emotional confusion. Public life became performance. Comparison became constant. Attention itself fragmented into endless streams of outrage and stimulation. And many individuals slowly lost the ability to sit quietly with themselves. Silence became uncomfortable. Stillness became threatening. Because without distraction, deeper questions emerged. Who am I really? What is my life aimed toward? Am I becoming stronger or weaker? Am I living truthfully? These questions haunted modern people because beneath technological progress remained the same ancient psychological realities humanity always faced. Fear, mortality, loneliness, desire, chaos, meaning. No amount of convenience erased them. And perhaps this was why Peterson remained such a polarizing figure. He forced people into uncomfortable territory. He spoke openly about hierarchy, competence, aggression, suffering, ideology, religion, responsibility, and psychological darkness during a period when many institutions preferred safer language and simpler narratives. To supporters, this felt courageous. To critics, it sometimes felt reactionary, rigid, or dangerous. But regardless of opinion, his impact revealed something undeniable about modern society. Millions of people were starving for seriousness, for structure, for moral language, for frameworks capable of confronting suffering honestly rather than merely distracting people from it. And behind everything he taught remained the same warning that had haunted him since his youth studying totalitarian regimes. Civilization is not guaranteed. Human beings are not automatically rational or good. Resentment spreads easily. Crowds become dangerous quickly. And when individuals stop taking responsibility for truth within themselves, chaos eventually spreads outward into society. This was why personal responsibility mattered so profoundly to him. Not because individual discipline magically solves every social problem, but because civilization itself depends upon enough people voluntarily resisting bitterness, deception, nihilism, and ideological possession within their own minds. The battle between order and chaos was never merely political. It was personal, daily, internal, and perhaps that was the reason his words reached so many people living through the confusion of modern life. Beneath the controversy, beneath the debates and internet wars, many listeners recognized an older message hidden inside the lectures. That a meaningful life is not built through comfort alone. It is built slowly through courage, truth, sacrifice, responsibility, and the willingness to confront suffering without allowing suffering to turn the human soul bitter.